suspended securely within the absolute freezing abyss of deep space at a meticulously maintained operational temperature of exactly 7 Kelvin. The James Webb Space Telescope silently pivots its magnificent array of hexagonal golden mirrors to painstakingly capture the incredibly faint infrared whispers emitting from an allegedly barren and highly unremarkable patch of the distant, ancient cosmos. Deep within the heavily shielded and profoundly hypercooled instrumentation bay of the orbital observatory, the highly sensitive mid-infrared instrument suddenly registers an unprecedented optical deviation that completely defies all established cosmological models and instantaneously triggers an unstoppable cascade of blaring automated diagnostic alarms across the primary control terminals back on Earth. Operating under the dim lights of the Space Telescope Science Institute in Baltimore, exhausted astrophysicists initially dismissed the glaring telemetry spike as a mere sensor malfunction before the incredibly precise near-infrared camera independently confirms the exact same terrifying redshift anomaly with an absolute, uncompromising mathematical certainty that leaves the entire room in dead silence. Staring at the cascading numbers, researchers realize the incoming data stream paints a horrifyingly clear and physically impossible picture of a distant, supermassive black hole that has mysteriously halted its natural rotation and violently reversed its immense spin in direct defiance of every known law of thermodynamics and angular momentum governing celestial mechanics in the observable universe. Meticulously passing through the raw, uncorrupted telemetry files downloaded from the satellite network, horrified data analysts calculate an astonishing 99.7% signal deviation rate that mathematically proves this violent astronomical reversal is not some random cosmic fluctuation, but rather a highly localized and impossibly precise phenomenon of unfathomable proportions. This sudden and unprecedented violent shift in the monstrous singularity's underlying gravitational architecture has instantaneously redirected a phenomenally powerful astrophysical relativistic jet comprised of supercharged plasma and lethal gamma radiation directly out from the chaotic center of its violently swirling accretion disk into the otherwise pitch-black void of the surrounding cosmos. Frantically mapping the exact geometric trajectory of this blistering cosmic laser beam across the vast interstellar medium reveals a chilling vector equation that intersects perfectly with the orbital path of our solar system, effectively turning a distant galactic anomaly into a hyperlethal extinction event heading straight toward our completely defenseless and blissfully unaware blue planet. Desperately scrambling to find a singular mathematical flaw in these catastrophic projections, the chief NASA engineers continuously run the orbital intersection algorithms through multiple isolated supercomputing clusters, only to watch helplessly as every single independent simulation confirms the 99.7% probability of a completely unavoidable and incredibly fatal strike. Factoring in the sheer relativistic velocity of the accelerated particle stream means this devastating wave of localized universal destruction is actively tearing through the fabric of space at nearly the speed of light, drastically compressing the tiny sliver of a timeline that humanity actually has left before our protective atmosphere is completely and irrevocably obliterated from existence. As the frozen telemetry screens of the JWST control room brightly illuminate the utterly terrified faces of the greatest scientific minds currently on Earth, a horrifying and unanswerable question softly echoes through the suffocating silence regarding what unfathomable and actively hostile cosmic entity possesses the sheer unimaginable power to weaponize a supermassive black hole directly against us. Beyond the silent, icy vacuum of deep interstellar space, the newly redirected relativistic jet manifests as a malignant cosmic cancer cell, aggressively slicing through the delicate structural filaments of the ancient galactic web while accelerating across the dark void, with the merciless, systematic intent of absolute planetary annihilation as this blinding column of supercharged plasma and hyper-focused gamma rays rapidly transforms pristine space into a chaotic killing field. As this unrelenting energy beam violently tears through the surrounding interstellar medium, its unimaginable kinetic energy instantly vaporizes entire stellar nurseries, casting grotesque, shadowy silhouettes across neighboring planetary systems that are being snuffed out within seconds as the sheer destructive magnitude of this monstrous particle stream reshapes local space into an uninhabitable, radiation-soaked wasteland, spanning a physical width that dwarfs the total diameter of our entire solar system multiple times over. This impending cosmic death sentence completely eliminates any theoretical possibility of orbital evasion, forcing terrified scientists to recognize that no vault or deep space shelter could ever survive the absolute physical dissolution promised by its arrival, as the inescapable tidal wave of pure energy surges directly along our galactic plane, distorting the fundamental fabric of space-time along its deadly trajectory. The supercharged particle beam warps background starlight into grotesque, flickering halos of crimson light, creating an eerie optical phenomenon that appears as though the void itself is bleeding into the darkness, while visually signaling the arrival of a localized Armageddon that will reduce our entire planetary system to scorched atomic debris. As the leading edge of this high-energy particle shockwave violently grazes distant cometary bodies in the outer Oort cloud, pristine icy megastructures are instantly sublimated into massive, glowing clouds of ionized gas, offering a chilling and horrifying preview of the thermal death that awaits the inner rocky worlds as the catastrophic force strips away ancient orbital stability and hurls shattered debris across the cosmos. When the primary radiation front finally breaches Earth's protective magnetosphere, the invisible torrent of relentless gamma-ray bombardment will instantly ionize the upper atmosphere, turning our peaceful blue skies into a searing furnace of shimmering, toxic auroral fires that herald the immediate extinction of all surface life as global electrical networks disintegrate under an unprecedented electromagnetic wave. Simultaneously, the intense thermal flux will cause the vast oceans to boil violently into superheated atmospheric steam within a matter of hours, completely stripping away our water supply, while the raw molecular bonds holding all living organisms together are systematically dismantled by the unstoppable beam as the underlying terrestrial crust cracks open to expose massive, churning rivers of incandescent molten rock. Humanity's entire physical legacy, from towering modern metropolises to ancient stone monuments, will be thoroughly reduced to microscopic ash, leaving behind a sterile, silent sphere, drifting helplessly through an endlessly darkening, hostile void, as our dead world becomes a burnt, forgotten monument to the uncaring brutality of a universe that snuffs out entire civilizations without a single moment of hesitation. This catastrophic extinction event will unfold with such terrifying speed and absolute efficiency that no living creature on Earth will have the time to fully comprehend the celestial execution order issued billions of years ago in the deep cosmos, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that our peaceful solar sanctuary was merely an illusion waiting to be shattered by an unstoppable cosmic force moving through the abyss. As the catastrophic countdown ticks relentlessly closer toward our total obliteration, a deeply unsettling realization begins to dawn on the desperate astrophysicists monitoring the incoming telemetry. Could a random natural event truly align itself with such mathematically terrifying precision, or are we witnessing the firing of an ancient intelligent doomsday weapon deliberately aimed to erase humanity from the cosmos? Looking back across the unfathomable expanse of 13.8 billion years, to the silent stillness of the primordial cosmic dark ages, reveals an ancient universe that historically appeared to early 20th century astronomers as a perfectly balanced, entirely predictable mechanical system governed by elegant and unbreakable mathematical rules, rather than being plagued by such violently unpredictable and aggressively hostile cosmic anomalies. When brilliant scientific pioneers like Albert Einstein originally constructed their foundational frameworks outlining general relativity during the early 1900s, they actively comforted themselves with the immensely reassuring illusion of a static and unchanging cosmological constant that mathematically guaranteed a stable eternal void, free from the sudden catastrophic reorientations of supermassive singularities we are witnessing right now. Even as Edwin Hubble eventually shattered this fragile historical paradigm by definitively proving that the cosmos was steadily expanding outward in all directions, the overarching scientific consensus stubbornly maintained that all grand celestial movements remained bound by absolute physical laws operating predictably on incredibly slow evolutionary timelines, spanning hundreds of millions of years, rather than instantaneous catastrophic reversals. For multiple generations, humanity has blissfully observed the glittering tapestry of the night sky through the incredibly comforting lens of a reliable clockwork mechanism, where distant galaxies drifted gracefully and ancient black holes consumed surrounding matter with a steady, predictable astronomical rhythm that offered absolutely no immediate physical threat to the quiet structural integrity of our deeply isolated terrestrial solar sanctuary. Decades of meticulously recorded archival data gathered by primitive terrestrial observatories and early orbital satellites completely failed to predict any viable cosmological scenario where an established gravitational titan could suddenly snap its immense rotational axis with the terrifying hyper-violent swiftness of a predatory strike, severing the invisible space-time tethers that have held it perfectly stable since the dawn of cosmic creation. The utterly devastating realization washing over deeply traumatized modern astrophysicists today is that every single reassuring textbook written throughout human history represents nothing more than a profound and dangerous delusion born entirely from our painfully limited and incredibly brief window of cosmic observation, giving us a false sense of security in a universe that is fundamentally armed and incredibly dangerous to unprotected life. This newly weaponized supermassive singularity is actually an ancient relic forged in the violently chaotic primordial crucible of the early universe, possessing a deeply archaic and long-dormant kinetic energy that all of our modern mathematical models completely failed to account for in their desperate centuries-long historical attempts to neatly rationalize the terrifying darkness that continuously surrounds our fragile, pale blue dot in the void. The comforting historical narrative deeply ingrained in our culture, suggesting that humanity was safely born into a gently aging and wonderfully calm universe, is now brutally dismantled by the undeniable telemetry, showing a monstrous celestial entity, behaving not like a predictable dying star, but exactly like a malevolent apex predator, violently waking from a billion-year slumber to deliberately target our specific coordinates in the Milky Way. All of the brilliant scientific achievements and theoretical physics breakthroughs pioneered by humanity over the last 3 centuries have incredibly and tragically culminated in merely building the perfect orbital infrared mirror required to flawlessly watch our own inevitable destruction approaching, without providing even a single theoretical defensive solution to actually stop the blinding, relativistic death beam from reaching our atmosphere. As the rapidly crumbling foundations of classical terrestrial astronomy completely collapse into obsolete ruins beneath the absolutely crushing physical reality of this rapidly approaching gamma-ray tide, we are forced to ask what other unfathomable cosmic horrors are actively hiding in the historical dark, waiting patiently for the perfect celestial moment to turn their predatory gaze upon our incredibly vulnerable and totally doomed solar system. The mathematical impossibility of this perfectly aligned celestial execution completely shatters our traditional understanding of the Fermi Paradox by suggesting that the deafening silence of the cosmos is not an accident of nature, but rather the direct result of a highly active and deeply predatory great filter that systematically eradicates any emerging civilization before it can spread into the stars. Humanity is violently forced to confront an agonizingly profound sense of cosmic loneliness as we finally realize that the vast universe we once viewed as a magnificent but passive backdrop is actually an incredibly hostile environment actively targeting our fragile existence with an unfathomable malice that renders all of our terrestrial struggles and glorious achievements completely and utterly meaningless. For decades, we foolishly sent hopeful radio transmissions into the pitch-black void, hoping to find kindred spirits among the glittering galaxies without ever considering the horrifying probability that this invisible and omnipotent great filter was silently using our incredibly naive broadcasts as a precise targeting beacon to calibrate the apocalyptic fury of a reversed supermassive black hole against us. The staggering realization that this relativistic beam boasts a calculated trajectory with a 99.7% strike probability eradicates the comforting philosophical concept of an indifferent universe in favor of a much darker paradigm where an incomprehensibly ancient cosmic intelligence deliberately orchestrates hyper-extinction events to keep the boundless interstellar territories entirely barren. Peering into the absolute deepest reaches of the observable cosmos has ironically stripped humanity of its precious cosmological ego by brutally reducing our entire thriving civilization to the status of a microscopic cosmic pest that is about to be systematically exterminated by a universe-spanning sanitation protocol operating on a terrifying scale of destruction that simply defies basic human comprehension. All of our spectacular technological advancements and philosophical enlightenments achieved over millennia suddenly feel pathetically small when weighed against the horrifying truth that our ultimate cosmic destiny is merely to become another anonymous layer of scorched atomic debris floating aimlessly through a cold galactic graveyard that is already filled to the brim with the silent ashes of forgotten worlds. We are now forced to radically reinterpret the seemingly empty expanses of deep space, not as a peaceful frontier waiting to be explored by future generations, but as a highly weaponized and rigorously patrolled quarantine zone designed to instantly vaporize any intelligent biological species that dares to raise its head above the dirt and attempt to understand the sacred mechanics of the surrounding cosmos. The deeply rooted anthropocentric belief that human beings are somehow incredibly special or divinely protected by the fundamental structure of reality is violently torn to shreds by the undeniable mathematical certainty of an impending blast of hyper-focused gamma radiation that views our entire planetary biosphere as nothing more than a minor rotational friction meant to be erased from the universal ledger. As we collectively stare through the golden hexagonal mirrors of our most advanced orbital observatories into the terrifyingly active and aggressively malevolent cosmic dark, we are paralyzed by the agonizing philosophical dread of knowing that the exact instrument of our total physical annihilation was birthed billions of years before our tiny blue planet even managed to coalesce from the primordial solar dust. With the absolute existential certainty of our impending planetary erasure firmly established as an undeniable mathematical fact hidden within the chilling telemetry of this approaching gamma beam, a terrifying question emerges that threatens to break the minds of our greatest theoretical physicists regarding exactly how the supposedly unbreakable laws of nature were so easily shattered to allow this nightmare. deep within the heavily fortified data processing centers at the Space Telescope Science Institute. Completely bewildered astrophysicists helplessly watch as an overwhelming flood of impossible telemetry systematically dismantles the foundational laws of thermodynamics right before their terrified eyes, as the black hole metrics completely shatter every established rule of angular momentum known to modern humanity. For over a century, Albert Einstein's elegant theory of general relativity provided a supposedly unbreakable mathematical framework for understanding gravity. But this sudden cosmic reversal produces violent gravitational waves that violently tear those historic equations into entirely useless, archaic fragments of completely obsolete scientific assumptions that fail to explain this rapidly approaching apocalypse. Simultaneous secondary readings, captured by the exquisitely sensitive orbital interferometers, violently spike as they register massive ripples in the fabric of space-time, confirming a localized gravitational torque so fundamentally extreme that it completely defies the strictly conserved quantities of standard particle physics and radically rewrites the absolute baseline parameters of universal celestial mechanics. Staring blankly at the rapidly fluctuating data arrays, terrified researchers suddenly realize that for a supermassive singularity to abruptly halt its immense multi-billion-year spin and violently reverse direction, an entirely new and fundamentally destructive physical force must have been introduced directly into the supposedly impenetrable event horizon from an unknown and highly terrifying external source. The sheer amount of kinetic energy required to accomplish such an instantaneous rotational flip absolutely violates the sacred law of energy conservation by requiring an energy output vastly exceeding the total combined luminous power generated by every single burning star currently existing within the observable universe, all violently focused into one impossibly small and terrifyingly specific galactic point. Desperately attempting to find a logical technological flaw in the terrifying optical transmission, the lead mission, scientists continuously recalibrate the delicate internal cryocoolers, maintaining the precise 7 Kelvin operating temperatures of the primary infrared sensors, only to repeatedly confirm that this horrific cosmological impossibility is actually happening exactly as the raw telemetry coldly dictates. Highly specialized spectrographic analysis of the incredibly violent accretion disks surrounding the newly reversed singularity reveals a horrifying microscopic tearing in the local space-time manifold, suggesting that the fundamental atomic structure of reality itself is rapidly disintegrating under the crushing weight of a gravitational anomaly that simply should not be mathematically capable of existing in nature. Utilizing the unprecedented resolution capabilities of both the mid-infrared instrument and the near-infrared camera, panicking astronomers desperately isolate the rapidly accelerating redshift anomaly, confirming with absolute and deeply chilling certainty that the bizarre energetic physics propelling this lethal particle beam toward Earth are completely immune to any established cosmological friction or decay. As the blindingly complex diagnostic algorithms repeatedly fail to map the corrupted physics of this approaching apocalypse, humanity is brutally forced to accept that our most advanced scientific measuring tools have essentially become nothing more than incredibly expensive chronometers, uselessly counting down the rapidly vanishing seconds, until a completely unpredictable cosmic phenomenon sterilizes the planet. With our sacred contemporary physics models lying completely shattered on the floor of the control room, and our greatest orbital instruments offering absolutely no theoretical salvation, an utterly terrifying question begins to deeply haunt the frozen minds of these desperate scientists as they wonder what other widely accepted historical astronomical truths are about to be violently proven fatally wrong tonight. Delving deeply into the meticulously preserved historical archives of early 20th century astrophysics reveals a profoundly tragic irony concerning Albert Einstein and his magnificently elegant equations of general relativity, which historically promised humanity a deeply rational and highly predictable geometric universe governed by mathematically unbreakable laws that completely fail us today. When brilliant pioneering astronomers like Fritz Zwicky first began to carefully map the massive unseen gravitational forces binding ancient galactic clusters together during the 1930s, they fundamentally assumed that these invisible cosmological structures were inherently stable cosmic foundations, rather than highly volatile celestial powder kegs, capable of spontaneously redirecting their fury. For nearly 100 consecutive years, the global scientific community painstakingly built our entire modern understanding of complex celestial mechanics upon these supposedly infallible historical theories, entirely unaware that a single catastrophic localized anomaly deep within the distant cosmic void would violently render every carefully published astronomical textbook terrifyingly obsolete tonight. The deeply comforting and widely celebrated academic assumption that supermassive black holes strictly behaved as perfectly predictable thermodynamic engines, steadily devouring local matter across incredibly vast evolutionary timescales, is now ruthlessly exposed as a pathetic planetary hubris born from an extremely limited historical observational window that blinded humanity to true cosmic violence. Frantically digging through the deeply encrypted digital vaults containing the most prestigious astrophysical journals published since the dawn of the space age, desperate modern researchers are completely failing to find even a single forgotten footnote or discarded historical hypothesis that adequately predicts how a monstrous gravitational singularity could instantaneously alter its primary rotation. Humanity is now brutally confronting the truly agonizing realization that all of our celebrated historical observatories and meticulously constructed terrestrial telescopes were essentially blinding us with the comforting illusion of pristine cosmic order while simultaneously failing to detect the terrifyingly chaotic mathematical reality that was secretly incubating within the darkest regions of space. The absolute foundational bedrock of the traditional scientific method, which relies entirely upon the careful observation of naturally repeating celestial patterns, is catastrophically unraveling, because this highly targeted doomsday event represents an entirely unprecedented and devastatingly singular historical anomaly that completely refuses to conform to any previously recorded universal parameter. If the incredibly brilliant early pioneers of modern quantum mechanics and general relativity had somehow been able to mathematically anticipate this apocalyptic level of rapid cosmic instability, they likely would have immediately abandoned their glorious pursuit of absolute universal formulas and instead desperately warned future generations to prepare for the violent unraveling of all known reality. As the highly lethal relativistic jet silently accelerates across the intervening cosmic expanse at incredibly unfathomable speeds, it systematically renders every single magnificent human discovery and theoretical breakthrough spanning the last 3 centuries entirely historically irrelevant, because knowing exactly how the universe is supposed to properly function cannot shield us from its sudden wrath. With the deeply treasured and heavily protected archives of human astrophysics now essentially reduced to completely useless mathematical scribbles in the face of an absolute planetary annihilation event, we must horrifyingly ask if this spontaneous, catastrophic rewriting of established celestial law implies that our fundamental reality is currently being manually overridden by a highly hostile intelligence. The sudden and catastrophic death of absolute scientific certainty violently plunges the collective global consciousness of humanity into a profoundly terrifying existential crisis, where the supposedly immutable fundamental mathematical rules currently governing our highly fragile planetary reality can be effortlessly overwritten without the absolute slightest cosmic warning from the surrounding dark universe. If the foundational laws of particle physics and gravity we have stubbornly relied upon for centuries are merely temporary cosmic illusions conjured by a severely limited observational bias, then the incredibly horrifying truth is that human existence remains completely and utterly unprotected from the malicious, rapidly fluctuating, and violently chaotic whims of a deliberately hostile, expanding universe. For thousands of consecutive generations, our terrestrial ancestors hopefully looked upward and inherently trusted that the glittering celestial mechanics above were essentially a massive protective canopy, keeping the chaotic primordial darkness firmly at bay through beautifully rigid structural equations that fundamentally guaranteed the ultimate long-term safety of our deeply isolated blue solar sanctuary. That profoundly beautiful psychological safety net has now been ruthlessly incinerated by the blistering, unarguable telemetry of this localized anomaly, forcing modern philosophers and terrified physicists alike to confront the truly agonizing realization that our precious tiny world is nothing more than a temporary mathematical rounding error, floating completely blindly through a remarkably apathetic void. Every magnificent soaring cathedral ever masterfully built, every profoundly moving poetic masterpiece ever beautifully written, and every single incredibly bitter ideological war ever brutally fought upon the surface of our ancient planet are immediately rendered completely meaningless when mathematically measured against the crushing realization that the cosmos casually intends to erase us from the ledger. This absolutely terrifying breakdown of natural cosmological law deeply amplifies the agonizing isolation heavily embedded within the infamous Great Filter theory by definitively proving that the deafening silence of the starry cosmos is aggressively maintained by an omnipotent mechanism that selectively rewrites fundamental physical reality itself just to flawlessly annihilate emerging biological species. We deeply and arrogantly believed that aggressively climbing the steep technological ladder of modern civilization would eventually grant us the godlike ability to successfully tame the surrounding galaxies. But this catastrophic gravitational reversal brutally demonstrates that we have merely been childishly playing with brightly colored cosmic toys inside an incredibly lethal and heavily monitored dark cage. As the hyperlethal relativistic particle beam silently continues its absolutely merciless sprint across the intervening interstellar medium, it carries with it the profound philosophical terror that absolutely no amount of human intellect or collective spiritual enlightenment can ever successfully negotiate with a fundamentally broken universe that actively despises the incredibly fragile spark of conscious life. We are rapidly and violently being forced to completely abandon our deeply cherished historical anthropic principles and finally accept our agonizingly pathetic cosmic status as helplessly paralyzed biological spectators, permanently strapped into the front seat of a rapidly disintegrating planetary roller coaster that was intentionally designed by an incredibly sadistic cosmic architect to spectacularly crash. With the heavily comforting and profoundly deceptive veil of absolute scientific predictability now violently torn away to reveal the raw, churning madness of this highly localized extinction protocol, what truly unspeakable and globally devastating physical horrors will physically manifest when this massive corrupting wave of shattered space-time finally crashes directly into the delicate orbits of our solar system. The sudden and incredibly violent mechanical reversal of this supermassive cosmic singularity has aggressively birthed an unstoppable series of devastating gravitational tsunamis that are currently racing across the pitch-black void with absolute merciless velocity to completely annihilate the delicate structural integrity of our entire beautifully balanced but woefully unprotected planetary solar system today. As these invisible and phenomenally powerful shockwaves silently ripple through the interstellar medium, they brutally distort the fundamental fabric of space-time itself by viciously bending the ancient light of background galaxies into monstrous and grotesquely smeared crimson halos of terrifying optical distortion that perfectly signal the rapidly approaching absolute physical doom of the human civilization. The incredibly terrifying computer simulations, meticulously generated by NASA supercomputers, vividly depict an impending and completely unavoidable physical cataclysm, where this rapidly advancing, invisible tide of pure gravity will effortlessly rip the massive outer gas giants directly from their ancient stable orbits and violently hurl them inward toward the fragile terrestrial planets like massive bowling balls, registering an absolutely horrifying 99.7% signal anomaly rate on the highly sensitive orbital interferometers. These relentless gravitational pulses carry enough concentrated kinetic energy to completely shatter the fragile tectonic plates of Earth in a matter of terrifying milliseconds, while violently stripping away the protective magnetic field that shields our delicate biological biosphere. Before the intensely lethal gamma radiation beam even manages to physically strike the upper atmosphere, this advancing gravitational compression wave will mercilessly squeeze our tiny blue planet with such unfathomable celestial pressure that the vast terrestrial oceans will immediately surge into towering hyper-tsunamis that effortlessly swallow entire continental landmasses in a blindingly chaotic rush of dark water. Humanity is now agonizingly forced to collectively watch in pure, unadulterated primal terror as the cold and uncaring universe aggressively demonstrates its limitless destructive capacity by effortlessly turning the fundamental laws of celestial mechanics into a horrifyingly precise planetary execution protocol designed to ruthlessly crush our fragile biological existence into microscopic, forgotten atomic dust particles. When the primary crest of this space-time distortion finally collides directly with the swirling plasma core of our life-giving sun, the resulting physical disruption will instantly trigger a violently chaotic stellar cascade that physically tears the star apart from the inside out and instantly plunges whatever remains of our shattered terrestrial home into the absolute freezing darkness of an eternal cosmic midnight. The severely distorted gravitational shear forces will simultaneously shatter the seemingly eternal orbital anchor of our silver moon into trillions of jagged, hyper-accelerated rocky fragments that will immediately rain down upon the boiling surface of the Earth like a merciless and completely inescapable apocalyptic meteor storm of biblical proportions, permanently erasing every single monumental trace of human history. This catastrophic physical restructuring of our localized planetary neighborhood completely exposes the terrifying and unarguable underlying reality that our previously comforting universe is not a gentle, nurturing cradle for conscious biological life, but rather a highly volatile and incredibly dangerous cosmic slaughterhouse where entire thriving solar systems are brutally butchered by completely invisible ancient forces. With the violently distorted gravitational shockwave rapidly crossing the final astronomical distance toward our deeply doomed blue planet and absolutely zero hope for physical salvation remaining for humanity, we must desperately ask exactly what horrifying hidden secrets are perfectly buried deep within the raw spectroscopic telemetry waiting to meticulously map out the final agonizing seconds of our planetary death. Diving deeply into the highly encrypted spectroscopic archives specifically captured by the unbelievably precise near-infrared spectrograph, Onboard the James Webb Space Telescope reveals a terrifyingly precise cosmological redshift value, permanently locked at exactly z equals 12.4, which mathematically pinpoints the exact origin of this horrific doomsday beam directly within the cosmic dark ages. Meticulously analyzing the microscopic fluctuations heavily embedded within the continuous high-energy electromagnetic spectrum shows the incoming relativistic gamma radiation operating at an astonishingly concentrated frequency that completely overwhelms our most advanced particle detectors, currently monitoring the absolute darkest and most intensely frozen sectors of the expanding outer universal boundary. Terrified astrophysicists desperately translating these purely abstract continuous wavelengths into a rigid chronological framework suddenly realize that the exact spacing between the corrupted photon bursts perfectly constitutes a highly specific and utterly merciless mathematical countdown to absolute planetary annihilation, ticking away with horrifying precision across the pitch-black interstellar medium. The relentless influx of incredibly dense cosmic ray data streaming directly into NASA's primary servers vividly illustrates a hyper-accelerated particle wave carrying an estimated kinetic payload of roughly 400 million electron volts per subatomic strike, completely guaranteeing the absolute molecular sterilization of any biological organisms unfortunate enough to be caught within its blazing path. These cold and heavily verified statistical parameters offer absolutely no philosophical comfort or emotional solace, because the raw numerical output generated by the supercomputers systematically proves that the incoming relativistic jet is maintaining a staggeringly flawless geometric trajectory that mathematically forbids even the absolute slightest possibility of a miraculous planetary near miss today. Recently published urgent classified memorandums desperately circulate among the highest echelons of the renowned journal. Nature coldly verified that the precise spectroscopic absorption lines perfectly matching this localized anomaly essentially confirm the complete disintegration of standard quantum mechanics, right as the invisible wave aggressively approaches the extreme outer boundary of our heliosphere. Peering intensely through the heavily shielded digital monitors at the Space Telescope Science Institute reveals a cascading waterfall of terrifying mathematical equations that brutally translate the invisible approaching gamma-ray barrage into a highly predictable mechanical sterilization process, completely devoid of any grand cosmic malice, but rather operating with the chilling efficiency of an exterminator, operating continuously at a strictly maintained temperature of -266 degrees Celsius. The hypersensitive internal cryocooler actively prevents any localized thermal interference from artificially corrupting the terrifyingly consistent astrophysical data stream that flawlessly maps the exact millisecond this lethal particle wave will brutally collide with our fragile atmosphere. Every single incredibly sophisticated optical sensor currently orbiting within the freezing vacuum of space is now essentially functioning as a highly advanced biological execution clock, meticulously documenting the unstoppable physical approach of an ancient astrophysical weapon that definitively and mathematically promises to instantly boil away the Earth's oceans in a single magnificent flash of radiation. As the meticulously recorded spectroscopic data absolutely confirms the inescapable physical reality of our rapidly approaching planetary demise, we must horrifyingly ask exactly what unspeakable global atrocities will vividly unfold across the terrified surface of the Earth when the blindingly hot leading edge of this ancient cosmic beam finally violently rips away the protective layers of our fragile sky. When the terrifyingly vast and towering wall of relativistic gamma radiation finally crashes directly into the fragile upper reaches of our planet's magnetosphere, the unimaginable subatomic force will violently incinerate the protective magnetic shields in a fraction of a second, leaving our entire pale blue world completely defenseless against the blinding cosmic firestorm that is accelerating rapidly through the solar system. Simultaneously, this hyper-focused, high-energy particle barrage will instantly ionize the delicate nitrogen and oxygen bonds within the upper stratospheric atmosphere, igniting a blinding atmospheric wildfire that permanently transforms our once peaceful blue sky into a roaring, lethal canopy of shimmering global aurora fires, capable of burning through every organic compound across the vast landmasses of Earth. Driven by the absolute thermal fury of the incoming beam, the vast global oceans will violently begin to boil away into massive plumes of superheated atmospheric steam within a few agonizing hours, relentlessly stripping our ancient planet of its precious liquid water supply while exposing the barren seafloors to the searing, completely relentless bombardment of raw, unshielded interstellar radiation. Stripped entirely of its ancient protective ozone layer, the exposed terrestrial surface will undergo an immediate and absolute biological sterilization as the unbelievably dense torrent of cosmic rays systematically dismantles the complex molecular structure of cellular DNA in every single living organism currently inhabiting the planet, leaving behind a completely silent and permanently scorched world. Towering concrete metropolises and massive industrial infrastructure built by humanity over countless centuries will offer absolutely no physical shielding against the devastating thermal flux. As the unbelievable energy density instantly vaporizes entire urban centers and rapidly reduces all monumental human architecture to microscopic, glowing ash that drifts aimlessly through a heavily poisoned sky. As the relentless gamma-ray assault continuously penetrates deep beneath the planetary crust, intense localized thermal expansion will cause massive ancient fault lines to violently fracture simultaneously, triggering apocalyptic global earthquakes and colossal volcanic eruptions that will pump millions of tons of incandescent molten rock directly onto the already boiling surface of our dying world. The complete physical dissolution of the atmosphere will permanently expose the charred tectonic plates to the absolute freezing vacuum of deep space once the initial radiation blast passes through, rapidly freezing the newly created sea of molten rock into a jagged, grotesque nightmare landscape of dark obsidian glass that will drift silently through space for the remaining billions of years. Within less than 24 total hours from the exact moment of initial cosmic impact, our once vibrant and thriving biosphere will be completely transformed into a sterile, desolate wasteland devoid of even the simplest microscopic life forms, permanently erasing the delicate ecological web that took nearly 4 billion years of continuous biological evolution to painstakingly construct. This terrifying simulation of global thermal annihilation clearly illustrates that no deep underground vault, highly fortified cavern, or orbital space station could ever hope to preserve human life against the sheer destructive kinetic energy brought by this cosmic beam, proving that our total planetary extinction is an absolute physical certainty the precise moment the main particle stream strikes. As we desperately stare at the horrifying mathematical certainty of this impending planetary execution, we are paralyzed by a far darker question. If natural astrophysical processes cannot possibly produce a particle beam of such concentrated, hyper-lethal precision, are we actually witnessing the automated firing of an ancient, cosmic weapon specifically designed to erase our civilization from existence? Looking deeply into the fascinating historical origins of modern terrestrial radio astronomy during the early 1930s reveals an era when brilliant pioneers like Carl Jansky first captured the beautifully innocent static whispers echoing from the distant center of our glorious Milky Way galaxy, without possessing even the absolute slightest inkling of the violent cosmic horrors hiding out within the dark void. For several optimistic decades, humanity enthusiastically constructed massive parabolic steel antennas across the terrestrial globe, firmly believing that patiently mapping these invisible, ancient electromagnetic waves would simply unlock the peaceful structural secrets of a deeply nurturing universe, rather than inadvertently building the exact, highly sensitive technological instruments required to witness our own execution. There exists a profoundly agonizing historical irony in the realization that the relentless multi-generational evolution of our most sophisticated telescopic hardware has ultimately served absolutely no higher philosophical purpose other than to flawlessly measure the incoming wavelength parameters of a lethal relativistic beam rapidly approaching our fragile planet with a mathematically undeniable apocalyptic precision. Whereas those earliest mid-century astronomical recordings consisted of remarkably chaotic and beautifully random radio static, the deeply chilling spectroscopic data currently flooding directly into NASA mainframe computers paints an unnervingly perfect geometric timeline of impending biological sterilization that completely lacks any of the comforting natural randomness previously associated with standard cosmic evolution. If those profoundly brilliant 20th century visionary astronomers had somehow mathematically anticipated that their magnificent pursuit of celestial knowledge would eventually culminate in capturing a perfectly localized 99.7% doomsday anomaly, they would have undoubtedly dismantled their rudimentary listening arrays and begged humanity to permanently turn its terrified eyes away from the stars. Our grand historical journey, transitioning from peering through fragile terrestrial optical lenses to deploying incredibly advanced hypercooled orbital infrared mirrors, now tragically appears as a completely futile technological march directly toward the terrifying realization that our beloved solar system is currently trapped directly inside the unyielding crosshairs of a monstrously ancient gravitational superweapon. Every single, incredibly meticulous astronomical catalogue and deep space chart, painstakingly compiled by countless generations of dedicated human researchers, is being violently rendered entirely historically irrelevant by an incoming blast of concentrated gamma radiation that actively refuses to obey any of the classical thermodynamic laws previously established during the golden age of early modern planetary astrophysics. The incredibly romanticized historical notion that gazing up into the nighttime sky beautifully connects us to the peaceful ancient light of long-dead stars has been ruthlessly transformed into a suffocating psychological nightmare where our incredibly sensitive observational technology simply forces us to helplessly watch an unstoppable celestial execution order accelerating rapidly across the intervening interstellar dust. Functioning as the ultimate technological descendant of those primitive early terrestrial radio antennas, the James Webb Space Telescope has ironically become nothing more than a magnificent $10 billion orbital tombstone, meticulously recording the absolute final mathematical coordinates of a doomed civilization that blindly reached out into the dark universe, only to inadvertently awaken a malevolent sleeping giant. With our extensively documented historical progression of cosmological discovery, culminating exclusively in the absolute definitive proof of our rapidly approaching planetary annihilation, we must horrifyingly ask if the truly terrifying reality of the speed of light essentially means this highly targeted doomsday weapon was deliberately fired billions of years before the Earth even managed to successfully form in the void. Because the fundamental speed of light dictates a rigidly unbreakable universal speed limit for all incoming celestial information, we are currently experiencing the ultimate cosmic tragedy of helplessly witnessing an apocalyptic planetary execution order that was ruthlessly signed and irrevocably sealed deep within the chaotic darkness of the primordial universe, billions of years before the Earth existed. Staring helplessly at this flawlessly fatal spectroscopic data, streaming into our heavily shielded orbital observatories, brutally exposes the agonizing philosophical paradox of watching our inevitable doom beautifully illuminated across the stars, while consciously knowing that humanity has actually been completely dead in the eyes of the indifferent cosmos since the very dawn of geological time itself. Every single magnificent triumph and utterly heartbreaking tragedy ever experienced throughout the incredibly brief flicker of human history was completely rendered entirely irrelevant the exact fraction of a second that this distant supermassive gravitational singularity abruptly reversed its terrifying eternal spin to perfectly align a relativistic death ray directly with our future solar coordinates. We are now being violently forced to painfully swallow the incredibly toxic existential realization that our seemingly vibrant and thriving blue world is essentially just a deeply tragic and highly temporary cosmic ghost projection, lingering within the vast interstellar void, entirely unaware that the devastating physical blast wave required to completely erase its presence is already practically here. The intensely suffocating psychological weight of this beautifully brutal astronomical determinism ruthlessly crushes the long-held philosophical illusion of free will, because our ultimate catastrophic destination was meticulously calculated and perfectly locked into the rigid mathematical framework of the expanding universe, long before the very first microscopic organisms even managed to form in the sea. Attempting to spiritually rationalize this incoming blast of concentrated hyperlethal gamma radiation requires humanity to fully embrace the terrifying concept of an unconditionally apathetic reality where entirely passive celestial mechanics naturally function as an unbelievably efficient interstellar exterminator, completely lacking even the slightest hint of conscious malice or divine intervention. This incredibly profound breakdown of human cosmic significance definitively proves that the agonizingly silent starry sky above our heads has never actually been a magnificent playground of boundless exploration, but rather functions as an incredibly vast and hopelessly dark celestial graveyard, patiently waiting for the precise mathematical moment to finally, enthusiastically welcome us into the abyss. Looking up at the shimmering constellations that have peacefully guided countless ancient terrestrial navigators across treacherous vast oceans, now violently evokes an incredibly deep primal terror as we finally understand that those exact same glittering stars are essentially completely unfeeling biological executioners actively carrying out a flawlessly preordained planetary sterilization protocol tonight. As the terrifyingly inevitable and heavily concentrated cosmic energy pulse ruthlessly consumes the absolutely final remaining astronomical distances separating our deeply fragile atmosphere from an absolute blazing eternity of total atomic silence. Humanity must collectively mourn the horrifying realization that our entire civilization was completely doomed before we ever even learned how to look upward. With the deeply comforting illusions of our cosmological importance completely shattered into trillions of violently jagged conceptual fragments, drifting through an uncaring void, we must absolutely terrify ourselves by asking what newly unhinged and completely radical astrophysical hypotheses will desperate scientists desperately construct to somehow explain away this flawless universal assassination. Desperately attempting to construct a mathematically viable physical framework to somehow rationally explain this absolute cosmological impossibility, terrified mainstream astrophysicists now aggressively scrutinize the highly controversial and incredibly violent hypothesis of an entirely unprecedented binary supermassive black hole merger continuously occurring deep within the absolutely chaotic heart of the distant galactic anomaly. Utilizing highly sensitive gravitational wave detectors stationed across the globe, frantic researchers meticulously pass through the heavily encrypted collision data, searching for the massive kinetic signatures required to generate the unbelievably extreme gravitational torque necessary to instantaneously flip a relativistic jet and completely reverse the primary rotation of an ancient billion solar mass cosmic singularity. Peering relentlessly through the precisely calibrated golden hexagonal mirrors of the James Webb Space Telescope, the deeply frozen mid-infrared instrument captures faint but undeniably chaotic thermal fluctuations echoing from the accretion disk that seem to perfectly validate this catastrophic orbital collision scenario where two immensely powerful celestial titans are violently wrestling for absolute physical dominance. The incredibly complex computer simulations generated by NASA mainframe servers brutally illustrate how the sheer rotational velocity of a secondary invading singularity could theoretically violently hijack the established angular momentum of the primary black hole, completely destabilizing its magnetic field and forcing the incredibly lethal jet of supercharged plasma to brutally reorient itself directly toward our solar system. Operating constantly at an uncompromising baseline temperature of exactly 7 Kelvin. The highly advanced onboard spectrometry sensors record a terrifyingly massive, localized redshift deviation of z equals 10.5 that perfectly corresponds with the mathematically predicted electromagnetic fallout of two monstrous event horizons violently tearing each other into microscopic subatomic shreds across the pitch-black void. However, as the world's most brilliant theoretical physicists carefully analyze the exact geometric parameters of this supposed cosmic collision, they quickly discover a deeply horrifying mathematical flaw, because the resulting relativistic particle beam should be violently oscillating wildly across the interstellar medium rather than maintaining a highly unnatural and flawlessly stable trajectory directly toward our fragile world. The absolutely staggering kinetic energy required to permanently stabilize such an immense astrophysical death ray completely defies the inherently chaotic thermodynamic nature of standard binary black hole mergers, brutally forcing researchers to acknowledge that some entirely unknown and incredibly powerful external physical mechanism must be actively dampening the violent orbital fluctuations to keep the Doomsday weapon perfectly aimed, desperately feeding the raw, uncorrupted light data continuously captured by the deeply shielded near-infrared spectrograph into highly advanced quantum processors, definitively proves that the rapidly approaching gamma radiation lacks the fundamental chaotic isotopic signatures always found within natural celestial collisions, strongly implying a terrifyingly calculated structural precision that completely defies normal stellar physics. With the incredibly comforting and highly rational mainstream hypothesis of a standard binary supermassive merger utterly collapsing under the crushing weight of its own irrefutable mathematical inconsistencies, the completely panicked global scientific community is now left staring blindly into a terrifying observational void, completely devoid of any naturally occurring astronomical explanations for this impending apocalyptic event. If standard celestial mechanics absolutely cannot account for the incredibly flawless orbital stability and hyperfocused trajectory of this highly lethal relativistic beam, what profoundly radical and utterly terrifying alternative hypotheses must we actively embrace to finally understand the true, unfathomably dark nature of the ancient cosmic intelligence that has clearly orchestrated our absolute biological planetary extinction? With the complete and catastrophic mathematical failure of traditional binary black hole merger models to properly explain this terrifyingly precise relativistic trajectory, truly desperate theoretical physicists are now reluctantly turning to the deeply unsettling and highly radical astrophysical hypothesis of sudden dark matter annihilation occurring directly within the churning center of the galactic core. This fundamentally terrifying cosmological concept suggests that the invisible gravitational scaffolding currently holding our entire known universe together is not merely inert mass, but rather a highly volatile and potentially weaponized primordial substance that can be deliberately ignited to generate the exact unfathomable kinetic energy required to instantaneously reverse an ancient supermassive singularity. Embracing this dark matter detonation theory violently drags humanity into the absolute darkest depths of the Fermi Paradox by forcing us to acknowledge the highly probable existence of an unfathomably ancient and incredibly malevolent cosmic intelligence, capable of actively engineering universal physics to successfully execute flawlessly targeted planetary extermination protocols across the starry void. The deeply agonizing philosophical implications of a deliberately weaponized singularity aggressively strip away the comforting historical illusion that we are merely the unfortunate victims of a random natural catastrophe and firmly place our fragile blue world at the exact epicenter of a meticulously calculated and universally scaled assassination plot designed to permanently erase our biological existence. If a truly omnipotent and entirely unseen interstellar architect is actively utilizing concentrated dark matter annihilation to manually redirect relativistic jets across billions of light years, it completely shatters the deeply arrogant human assumption that our heavily isolated planetary civilization was ever safely hidden from the predatory gaze of whatever apex predators silently roam the dark cosmos. We are violently forced to entirely reconsider the seemingly majestic and glittering expanse of the nighttime sky, not as a breathtaking canvas of endless discovery, but rather as a highly militarized and ruthlessly monitored extermination grid, where newly emerging intelligent species are systematically located long before they can ever threaten the established celestial hierarchy. This horrifying paradigm shift completely recontextualizes our incredibly brief technological evolution as nothing more than the pathetic struggling of a microscopic biological pest that has unfortunately just tripped an ancient and highly sensitive cosmic tripwire constructed from weaponized dark matter, intentionally stretched across the pitch-black void by an entirely incomprehensible alien civilization. The sheer staggering scale of using a perfectly calibrated supermassive black hole as a localized sniper rifle against a single insignificant solar system forces us to realize that to this ancient universal intelligence, erasing the entire collective history of the human race requires absolutely no more moral consideration than a terrestrial human thoughtlessly stepping on an entirely unnoticed ant hill. Staring directly into the rapidly approaching and impossibly perfect geometric trajectory of this artificial doomsday beam deeply amplifies our profound sense of cosmic loneliness, because we now know with absolute terrifying certainty that the universe is not quietly empty, but rather it is heavily populated by godlike entities who actively despise the fragile spark of human consciousness burning on Earth. As the desperate and deeply terrified global scientific community completely exhausts all remaining rational explanations for this mathematically impossible dark matter weaponization, we are forced to stare into the abyss and horrifyingly ask what forgotten primordial relics left over directly from the chaotic dawn of creation could possibly have supplied the original blueprint for our impending extinction. Delving incredibly deep into the highly theoretical and mostly discarded historical cosmological models originally proposed by visionary astrophysicists during the late 1970s, reveals an utterly terrifying alternative explanation involving incredibly dense primordial black holes violently forged during the absolutely chaotic first few milliseconds of the immensely powerful ancient Big Bang creation event. Brilliant theoretical physicists like Stephen Hawking and Yakov Zeldovich historically theorized that these microscopic but impossibly massive gravitational anomalies were permanently scattered across the rapidly expanding early universe, like highly volatile dormant cosmic landmines, patiently waiting for billions of consecutive years, hidden deep within the absolutely freezing and pitch-black interstellar void. Rather than witnessing a standard modern supermassive singularity suddenly and violently reversing its seemingly eternal rotation, we might actually be currently observing the completely horrifying spontaneous awakening of a massively ancient primordial relic that has quietly absorbed enough ambient cosmic radiation over 13 billion years to finally and critically destabilize its highly volatile internal physical structure today. This deeply chilling historical astrophysical hypothesis systematically shatters our carefully constructed chronological timeline of universal evolution by explicitly suggesting that the absolute greatest existential threats to human biological survival were essentially fully armed and completely operational long before the very first primordial terrestrial atoms ever even managed to successfully coalesce within our fragile solar system. Frantic modern researchers who are now desperately tearing through heavily encrypted digital archives containing many decades of deeply obscure quantum gravity research are suddenly discovering completely forgotten mathematical warnings that absolutely perfectly predict the catastrophic and highly violent uncoiling of these profoundly ancient gravitational springs directly upon our completely unsuspecting modern galactic neighborhood. The deeply comforting historical illusion that the profoundly ancient cosmic architecture of our known expanding universe eventually settled into a highly stable and permanently peaceful geometric configuration is completely and brutally eradicated by the absolutely undeniable mathematical evidence of this massive primordial beast, violently snapping its invisible space-time tethers in the absolute darkest depths of the distant void. By meticulously and mathematically tracing the incredibly raw energetic signature of this rapidly approaching doomsday particle beam all the way back to the exact initial quantum conditions of the early universe scientists, suddenly realize that this incredibly lethal relativistic jet is essentially composed entirely of the pure, unadulterated, chaotic cosmic fire violently left over directly from the original explosive dawn of time. All of the beautifully handwritten historical astronomical ledgers, carefully maintained by truly brilliant 18th century stargazers, now tragically represent absolutely nothing more than the profound biological arrogance of a fragile infant civilization that entirely failed to mathematically recognize the heavily camouflaged primordial monsters quietly sleeping right next door within the frozen expanses of the deep interstellar dark. If this incredibly lethal and rapidly approaching hyper-focused cosmic ray bombardment is truly the delayed kinetic result of a massively dense primordial black hole aggressively rupturing, then humanity is currently facing an absolutely inescapable biological execution order that was rigidly and mathematically locked firmly into the foundational fabric of universal reality at the exact glorious moment of ancient cosmic creation. As the profoundly terrifying realization that our total planetary annihilation is essentially a highly natural, albeit violently delayed, cosmological birth mechanism, finally, and deeply sets into the global scientific consciousness, we must desperately ask exactly what horrific physical transformations our deeply fragile terrestrial solar system will violently undergo the exact moment this ancient primordial energy physically hits us. Regardless of whether this rapidly approaching doomsday particle beam was initially birthed by an incredibly violent binary singularity merger or a highly weaponized primordial dark matter detonation, every single competing scientific hypothesis ultimately violently converges upon the absolutely undeniable mathematical certainty of total and completely inescapable terrestrial planetary sterilization occurring today. The greatest minds currently working at NASA and deeply analyzing these terrifying quantum gravity metrics have brutally realized that these profoundly diverse theoretical frameworks offer humanity absolutely zero physical salvation, but merely meticulously outline the different horrific methodologies by which our deeply fragile solar system will be violently, completely obliterated into invisible microscopic atomic ash. If the highly terrifying primordial black hole rupture theory is mathematically correct, then the initial physical strike upon our outer heliosphere will violently manifest as an unstoppable superheated plasma wave, instantly sublimating the massive frozen cometary bodies of the distant Oort cloud into brilliant glowing nebulae of violently expanding ionized gas, permanently scarring the outer edge of our solar system. Conversely, if this absolutely devastating relativistic jet is truly being aggressively propelled by a massive orbital collision of two immense gravitational titans, then the resulting space-time shockwave will mercilessly stretch and compress our entire terrestrial planetary neighborhood like a fragile glass marble caught directly inside the unimaginably crushing jaws of a rapidly accelerating cosmic industrial hydraulic press. Whichever cataclysmic origin story proves to be completely accurate, the highly lethal 99.7% probability of a direct orbital intersection absolutely guarantees that the initial burst of concentrated cosmic rays will instantly strip away our ancient atmospheric ozone layer and immediately plunge the entire suffocating terrestrial surface into an agonizingly blinding bath of pure, deadly ultraviolet light. The staggeringly immense kinetic energy actively driving this rapidly advancing doomsday weapon completely ensures that the subsequent thermal radiation blast will instantly boil away the magnificent global oceans into violently turbulent atmospheric storms, while simultaneously melting the deeply fractured continental tectonic plates into a terrifyingly vast, churning global sea of heavily irradiated, bubbling red incandescent rock. Every single brilliantly engineered architectural marvel and heavily fortified underground survival bunker, painstakingly constructed throughout the entirety of modern human history, will be effortlessly vaporized within a single terrifying millisecond, leaving absolutely no surviving archaeological footprint for any future interstellar explorers who might eventually wander into the deeply silent graveyard of our scorched planetary system. Humanity is fundamentally and absolutely trapped inside a profoundly horrific celestial execution chamber, where all heavily debated scientific hypotheses merely serve to explicitly detail the remarkably distinct atomic mechanisms by which our deeply fragile biological existence will be brutally torn apart by a completely merciless universe that has clearly decided our incredibly brief evolutionary experiment must end violently today. Meticulously monitored by the completely helpless scientists, silently weeping inside their heavily fortified terrestrial control rooms. The rapidly accelerating edge of this invisible cosmic firestorm has officially crossed the final planetary threshold and is currently preparing to unleash its absolute, unspeakable, destructive fury directly upon the desperately, completely unprotected and totally doomed populations of our dying world. As the absolute final terrifying seconds rapidly tick completely away on the incredibly precise atomic clocks directly tracking this apocalyptic cosmic collision, we must horrifyingly ask exactly what deeply agonizing final thoughts will violently consume the collective human consciousness when the blinding lethal light of our own total planetary extinction ultimately permanently erases the gentle blue sky above our fragile heads. As the catastrophic leading edge of the immensely concentrated relativistic particle beam violently breaches the absolute outer perimeter of our frozen Oort cloud. Heavily shielded deep space orbital telemetry platforms begin to systematically fail under an unprecedented barrage of supercharged ionized radiation that effortlessly incinerates their delicate quantum circuitry in complete agonizing silence. Operating completely helplessly at the very fragile edge of the heliosphere, billions of miles away from Earth, the legendary Voyager probes record a completely impossible thermal spike before their incredibly antiquated transmission equipment is brutally vaporized by a cascading shockwave of pure cosmic energy that is now rapidly aggressively advancing directly toward the inner rocky terrestrial planets. Frantically attempting to maintain a strictly controlled operating temperature of -266 degrees Celsius, the highly advanced internal cryocoolers aboard the James Webb Space Telescope completely overload as the hypersensitive mid-infrared instrument detects the massive approaching radiation tsunami violently warping the fundamental gravitational structure of our local neighborhood. Meticulously analyzing the continuously corrupting data streams pouring directly into the primary NASA mainframe supercomputers reveals an absolutely terrifying localized redshift value that mathematically guarantees the invisible gamma ray burst is accelerating across the interplanetary vacuum at approximately 99.9% of the absolute fundamental speed of light with zero deceleration. Inside the heavily fortified subterranean data processing centers, currently operating under emergency lockdown protocols, completely exhausted astrophysicists helplessly watch as their incredibly sophisticated early warning tracking algorithms violently crash under the sheer crushing weight of the impossible quantum mathematics required to effectively map the rapidly disintegrating fabric of local spacetime. The incredibly powerful orbital telescopes, forcefully commandeered by terrified government agencies, perfectly document the absolutely horrific moment the invisible Doomsday beam violently grazes the gaseous atmosphere of Neptune, instantly transforming the deeply frozen blue giant into a monstrously glowing sphere of chaotic superheated plasma that visually illuminates the pitch-black void like a dying sun. Every single magnificent piece of modern astronomical hardware painstakingly constructed to safely observe the majestic ancient cosmos from a comfortable planetary distance has now ironically been completely violently repurposed into nothing more than an agonizingly precise biological execution timer, meticulously calculating the exact fraction of a millisecond our delicate atmospheric shielding will finally fail. Highly sensitive gravitational wave interferometers, continuously operating deep underground, rapidly register catastrophic shear forces actively tearing through the invisible energetic web connecting the outer planets, vividly mathematically proving that this highly lethal particle stream possesses enough concentrated destructive mass to effortlessly rip the entire solar system into microscopically jagged debris. As the blistering, highly concentrated radiation front silently, relentlessly crosses the orbit of Mars and systematically prepares to completely unleash its absolute, unspeakable, destructive fury directly upon the desperately, completely unprotected and totally doomed populations of our heavily populated world. Absolutely all global satellite communication networks begin to simultaneously, tragically, violently fail. With the absolute final and incredibly fragile orbital defense telemetry nodes currently rapidly going completely dark across the entire terrified globe, we must deeply agonizingly ask exactly what unspeakable physical horrors will violently manifest on the Earth's surface when the blindingly lethal light of our own total planetary extinction ultimately permanently erases our heavily cherished technological eyes. Looking back across the intricately woven and deeply triumphant historical tapestry of human civilization reveals an incredibly fragile biological species that spent countless consecutive millennia desperately building a magnificent global empire, entirely unaware of the catastrophic celestial doom that was rapidly accelerating through the pitch-black interstellar void directly toward our delicate solar system today. Every single fiercely fought ancient territorial war and incredibly brilliant architectural renaissance meticulously documented within our heavily guarded global archives now essentially amounts to absolutely nothing against the unfathomable, crushing physical weight of this highly concentrated relativistic particle beam that fundamentally predates the very earliest primordial formation of our ancient terrestrial oceans. The incredibly arrogant and profoundly, deeply ingrained philosophical assumption that humanity was ultimately destined to majestically conquer the surrounding glittering galaxies has been violently shattered into microscopic intellectual fragments by the undeniable mathematical realization that we are merely a highly temporary biological rounding error existing helplessly inside an aggressively hostile cosmological arena. All of the beautifully sculpted marble monuments and heavily fortified concrete bunkers, painstakingly erected by countless forgotten terrestrial empires to permanently guarantee their eternal physical legacy, will be effortlessly reduced to glowing subatomic ash within a single terrifying millisecond of localized cosmic contact, as the ancient Doomsday weapon ruthlessly strikes the fragile outer layers of our atmosphere. For thousands of consecutive years, brilliant human astronomers hopefully mapped the shimmering constellations of the night sky using rudimentary glass lenses, completely, entirely blind to the highly horrifying truth that the absolutely magnificent starry vault above their heads was secretly harboring an unimaginably powerful execution mechanism operating with a flawlessly cold 99.7% strike accuracy. We are now violently being forced to painfully embrace the deeply suffocating existential reality that the entirety of human evolutionary development, from incredibly primitive cave dwellings to vastly sophisticated orbital space stations, represents absolutely nothing more than an insignificantly brief and pathetic cosmic spark that is currently about to be permanently extinguished by a completely apathetic galactic tide. The incredibly brilliant artistic masterpieces currently preserved within heavily climate-controlled subterranean terrestrial vaults will be violently, instantly vaporized, right alongside the incredibly complex technological databases containing the absolute sum of all gathered human knowledge, without leaving even the slightest microscopic historical trace within the vastly expanding frozen emptiness of deep space today. Our profoundly cherished historical anthropic principles dictating that the magnificent universe was somehow inherently designed to perfectly nurture biological consciousness are brutally fundamentally dismantled by the blindingly unarguable astronomical telemetry, completely proving that our delicate world has actually been sitting directly inside the merciless crosshairs of a supermassive black hole since the dawn of time. As the deeply horrifying cosmic countdown officially enters its absolute final and incredibly terrifying chronological phase, we rapidly, desperately realize that human history is entirely concluding, not with a beautifully triumphant interstellar expansion, but rather with a completely silent and profoundly merciless astronomical erasure that absolutely, completely refuses to even formally acknowledge our biological existence. With the entire miraculously incredibly complex and deeply beautiful historical legacy of our terrestrial planetary civilization currently hanging by a completely violently unraveling quantum thread, we must profoundly, horrifyingly ask exactly what unspeakable psychological madness will aggressively, violently grip the doomed human population when the absolutely inescapable, invisible, celestial death blow completely strikes. Humanity is now brutally forced to completely embrace the deeply terrifying existential reality of the heavily debated Great Filter as we painfully accept our absolute ultimate cosmic loneliness, while helplessly waiting for this incredibly lethal 99.7% relativistic light anomaly to finally strike our deeply fragile planetary home and permanently, completely absolutely erase our biological existence today. The profound collective ego of our incredibly advanced global civilization is currently being violently stripped entirely away as we finally correctly recognize our deeply pathetic planetary role as fleeting microscopic cosmic dust existing temporarily within a fundamentally hostile and utterly indifferent universe that actively, entirely, completely refuses to care if we successfully survive this rapidly approaching dark anomaly. Staring deeply into the heavily corrupted telemetry data streaming directly from our magnificent orbital observatories forcefully reveals the agonizingly profound philosophical truth that our uniquely vibrant biosphere was secretly always designated to function as nothing more than a highly temporary biological anomaly, violently destined to be perfectly corrected by this incredibly flawlessly aimed, supermassive celestial weapon. We collectively mourn the deeply tragic realization that our beautifully resilient terrestrial ancestors, who bravely crawled directly out of the ancient primordial oceans, entirely failed to somehow intuitively grasp that the seemingly peaceful, magnificent, glittering starry sky, completely constantly towering above their fragile heads, was secretly always actively hunting them down with an incredibly flawless astronomical precision. If this incredibly merciless universal extermination protocol mathematically strictly dictates that intelligent, conscious biological life is an entirely unacceptable celestial aberration, then the absolutely deafening, continuous silence of the surrounding deep, dark cosmos completely, and finally makes perfect, terrifying philosophical sense to our desperate, highly frantic, terrified astrophysicists watching the approaching doom today. The highly celebrated historical anthropic principle, which beautifully argued that this immensely vast, incredibly expansive universe was uniquely and finely tuned to perfectly nurture human consciousness, is now being violently, ruthlessly crushed into entirely useless intellectual dust by the rapidly advancing physical reality of a 99.7% completely fatal, completely inescapable, targeted cosmic collision. Every single profoundly moving spiritual philosophy and brilliantly constructed, organized global religion ever desperately practiced this across the entirely terrified surface of our doomed world is immediately rendered utterly and totally cosmically meaningless when mathematically directly compared against the absolutely staggering physical force of an ancient black hole violently throwing its entire gravitational fury against us now. We are currently deeply, completely, and fundamentally, totally, helplessly paralyzed by the absolutely agonizing psychological knowledge that there is genuinely, completely nowhere left to hide, because the exact foundational fabric of space-time itself has been radically and highly perfectly, artificially weaponized specifically against our exact precise, completely helpless, incredibly vulnerable, temporary planetary orbital coordinates. As we collectively sit in totally silent primal terror, patiently waiting for the blindingly intense, high-energy gamma radiation wave to finally physically and violently wash directly over our completely doomed pale blue planet, we rapidly and deeply lose psychological hope for any impossible mathematical salvation against this completely flawlessly executed, unstoppable cosmic extermination order. With the absolute final, profoundly terrifying, and deeply agonizing remaining temporal moments of incredibly precious and heavily cherished human biological existence, currently relentlessly ticking entirely away into the fundamentally uncaring deep, dark void. We must intensely and horrifyingly, desperately ask, exactly what utterly unspeakable physical torments wait perfectly hidden directly within the very heart of the blinding light. The absolutely inescapable and profoundly terrifying final descent into the pitch-black cosmic abyss officially begins the exact agonizing microsecond. The invisible leading edge of this hyper-lethal 99.7% relativistic doomsday beam violently strikes the uppermost protective layers of our deeply fragile terrestrial atmosphere, completely shattering the planetary magnetic field. In an absolutely blinding and totally silent flash of completely unparalleled destruction, the incredibly dense wave of high-energy gamma radiation systematically violently tears apart the fundamental molecular nitrogen and oxygen bonds that have peacefully sustained complex biological life for billions of consecutive years, instantly transforming the blue sky into a massive roaring canopy of atomic fire. Every single, incredibly majestic, towering mountain range and heavily populated, sprawling coastal metropolis is effortlessly and immediately vaporized into microscopically glowing subatomic ash, as the unbelievably crushing, localized thermal flux mercilessly, radically, unconditionally, fully, and irrevocably, completely, entirely, successfully, permanently, definitively eradicates all traces of human architecture today. The deeply magnificent and ancient global oceans that originally served as the precious, nurturing primordial cradle for all terrestrial biological evolution now violently, explosively boil completely away into entirely suffocating, massive, thick clouds of highly irradiated, superheated atmospheric steam, exposing the dark, profoundly scarred, barren, tectonic bedrock to the absolute freezing vacuum of open space. Penetrating completely relentlessly deep into the heavily fractured subterranean depths of the rapidly dying planetary crust, this unstoppable, staggering cosmic radiation storm systematically, brutally dismantles the incredibly delicate helical molecular structure of absolutely every single remaining biological cellular DNA strand, violently guaranteeing the perfect, total, absolute sterilization of this world. Within less than a single, deeply agonizing chronological fraction of an astronomical terrestrial second, our once breathtakingly vibrant, miraculously beautiful, perfectly beautifully flourishing planetary biosphere is completely brutally transformed into an entirely silent, totally pitch black, eternally scorched, desolate floating rock, utterly, entirely, fundamentally, completely devoid of absolutely any living soul. Having successfully, meticulously, perfectly, completely, entirely, flawlessly executed its highly targeted, ancient universal eradication protocol, without encountering even the absolute slightest microscopic frictional resistance, the magnificent, staggering, relativistic doomsday beam entirely effortlessly, completely silently, violently, aggressively, rapidly continues its pitch-black journey across the vast, dark galaxy. The deeply suffocating, completely paralyzing philosophical terror surrounding the highly debated Great Filter is now definitively, mathematically proven absolutely correct as our incredibly fragile, profoundly insignificant planetary existence is successfully, permanently, brutally, entirely, forcefully, relentlessly, efficiently, thoroughly, irrevocably, fully, forever removed from the cosmic universal ledger. An incredibly profound and profoundly crushing, absolute suffocating, dead pitch-black cosmological silence, violently, permanently, unconditionally, fundamentally, thoroughly, immediately, successfully, completely, forcefully, forever, rapidly, swiftly, aggressively, perfectly, permanently, flawlessly, instantly, brutally, entirely, irrevocably, unconditionally, successfully, fundamentally, completely, fully, forcefully, reclaims our solar system. As the highly irradiated, completely shattered, utterly desolate, dead silent, totally perfectly frozen charred remains of our once profoundly glorious terrestrial home, slowly, relentlessly, helplessly, entirely, aimlessly, drift permanently deeper into an entirely uncaring, endlessly pitch-black cosmic void, what other ancient nameless hyperpredatory gravitational anomalies are silently targeting another world next.